Thank you, Jamison Blake. Is that the abbreviation of James? Jimbus. Album review, James Blake, Playing Robots into Heaven. Before this all kicks off, like and subscribe. You thought you were going to get away from me that time? Nah. Comment as well. Be loud, be noisy, be annoying. This is the 6th full-length album from English singer, producer, multi-instrumentalist James Blake. It comes 2 years after his last full-length album, Friends That Break Your Heart. If you scroll back through my channel, that was actually the first album that I reviewed, and I loved it. This is a total stylistic 180 from that project. We get ventures into UK garage, IDM, micro house, some smatterings of his usual ambient pop and R&B. James is dipping back into a slightly more familiar zone with these tracks, going back a little bit to the very minimal indie-tronica that he dabbled in earlier in his career. Take the lead single, Loading, which teased with slinky grooves and alien vocal processing. The focus was clearly on repetition, subtle hypnosis through incremental additions of swirling strings and miscellaneous effects, rather than just cut and dry balladry. Tell Me contains these jerky, stuttering leads that blurt their way through a super rudimentary melody. They sound like a short-circuiting robot making its final death cry. It's all incredibly freaky and uncanny, yet still hyper groovy. I also get serious John Hopkins vibes off this track in particular. There's a really granular attention to detail on display. It's fantastic. Fall Back dials things back to an ultra-cerebral 5 as these persistent lead melodies cycle through some descending lines. James's vocals become stuck in this seemingly endless loop of a singular phrase, making for a bizarre earworm. There is Nicholas Jar written all over this track, especially in the way Blake plays with these splashes of random perks and heavily manipulated sounds in order to build an irresistible rhythm. He's been wonderful. I appreciate it. Is utterly perplexing, if only for its off-kilter balance of clubby 808 beats and intense gospel samples. There's also this recurring loop of a vocalist counting a song in 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, that becomes another rhythmic component. The structure of this thing is pretty simple, but the mesh of sounds is so disparate, it's like what I imagine dance music would sound like in the Twilight Zone. I Want You to Know is some cavernous UK garage in the vein of an artist like Burial. The spacious mix on this thing allows for some of the snappy percussion to really pop. Of course, it isn't James Blake without some oddity. Distant stabs of synth noise and choppy edits divert the song's path for a minute before we begin our ascent to heaven. Blake's vocal layering and the main sample of the track all coalesce into a kind of twisted but really beautiful sense of harmony. The clunky rhythms and plucky bits of synth on Night Sky only get the song so far, before it all gives way to an incredibly airy ambient outro. It's a weird collection of sounds and ideas, but it does lack the structural cogency that a lot of the other tracks on this album manage to tap into. I guess while I'm on the topic of not so enjoyable tracks, the song Big Hammer gets really tiring really fast. The patois rapped refrain that is incorporated into this song just goes on and 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 on. Not only that, but the beat itself is incredibly basic by James Blake's standards. A far cry from the superb detail and nuance that the rest of this project displays. Meh. Fire the Editor is more or less just a straight up Blake ballad. No frills per se, just some mournful, slightly sour synth work and a very ominous lyrical mood. Someone's in trouble, whether it be a literal editor or perhaps an entity whose identity is being hidden for the sake of subtlety and euphemism. There's a rather dejected, mutant vibe radiating off this one. Lovely. The penultimate track on this thing, If You Can Hear Me, features a very somber, patient piano line that guides some very poignant lyrics towards James's father. He seems to be lamenting about the fact that he drifted away to work on his dream of being a musician. The final lines sum up the idea of this track the best in my opinion. Took your lead, followed your dream, and I woke up from it even more tired. It's super stripped down and makes for quite an emotional gut punch. Sure, it's a little abrupt, could have been developed a little bit further. That doesn't take away from the feels, man. The ambient solemnity of the closing track, the title track, is a soothing send-off for this album. It does in a way feel a little bit like a funeral procession, or like the come down after an intense trip. Eerie, detuned synths ring out and chime their way through a very tight melodic sequence. There's a real isolating beauty about it, and it certainly stands on its own as a unique addition to the track list. Yeah, it's the same motif played for the duration, but it's that repetition legitimizes philosophy. This one bittersweet little phrase becomes much more powerful and overarching as a result of its continued presence. I think it's a great way to end the album. Blake threw everything and the kitchen sink at this album. You really do get a lot of the electronic music spectrum on this thing. As much as I loved his last album, it is really cool to hear him dip back into a sound and style that feels much more natural to him. The looping, the cycling grooves, the sound play, it really does seem like second nature to him. Perfect album? Nah. Good album? Yeah. Hotel? Trivago. Given this one an 8.6 out of 10. And don't you ever forget it. Oh, this one's a beauty. What another little album from James Blake. You remember what I said at the start? I imagine you do remember. Something about liking and perhaps subscribing and maybe even commenting. You know, doing all those things that make me feel, you feel good about yourself. Yeah, that's what's happening here. It was friends who broke my heart. I don't have to be sitting down for long, and it just happens. It just happens. Please listen to this album. It's very good. I'm recommending it to you. I want to know what you think about it. Treat yourself, but only in moderation. Don't treat yourself too much, otherwise it's not a treat anymore. I'm turning you off now. Look away. For the bonga donga.